So I have this project coming up where I'm going to be restoring this bedroom. The problem is that I've essentially been using it as a storage closet. All the extra stuff that I have that I don't know where to put kind of gets thrown in this room and then forgotten about. So the plan here for this video is to build some storage racks for the basement so that I can better organize all this stuff. That way I'm not relocating the problem from one room to another. So I went into SketchUp and started designing the storage racks and came up with this. The framing is made up of standard 2x4s and the shelf surfaces are made up of plywood. I notched out spaces for the vertical supports so that they would be flush with the front face of the shelving. You could make this project a lot easier though if you didn't do that and just have the vertical supports sticking out in front of the shelving. That would allow you to have a lot fewer cuts. I decided that even though the shelves are built just to be functional, I wanted to make something that I would be proud of building. Now in my basement where the wall meets the floor is a French drain, and this has a small lip that extends out from the wall. So on the back side of the vertical supports, I notched out a small section to fit over this lip. Having a 3D model that is to scale was very helpful because I could make a cut list and then cut all my pieces at once. I set up a makeshift stop block by clamping down a piece of wood on the table saw nearby. I then measured and marked the first piece and slid it into place, making sure that the mark lined up with the saw blade. I could then start making repeatable cuts for all of the pieces without measuring each time. For the plywood, I started with 4x8 sheets. Since each section of shelving was 2 feet deep and 4 feet wide, I could cut the plywood in half, once in each direction. I previously made myself a little jig that I could use like a track for my circular saw. I made it out of scrap MDF, and it worked pretty well, but I didn't make it wide enough to clamp down. The clamps ended up getting in the way while I was trying to cut through with the saw, so I ended up clamping next to the jig so that it couldn't move in that direction. As a bonus though, the whole house vacuum system that I restored in a previous video worked really well for dust collection, even if it did look a little bit awkward. The circular saw I'm using here is probably the lowest tier you can get. It also doesn't have a very good blade on it, so it caused some tear out near the edge of the plywood. Because of this, on the second and third sheets of plywood, I only cut them in half once using the circular saw, and used tape to prevent tear out. I then switched over to the table saw, and I didn't have the tear out problem. To cut out the notches for the vertical supports, I used a scrap piece of 2x4 to trace with a pencil, and then used a jigsaw to cut out the shape. The jigsaw caused some tear out as well, especially when cutting across the grain. It seemed to cause the most tear out on the side facing up, so whichever side of the plywood I didn't like, I would put facing up. For notching out the bottom of the vertical supports, I set my circular saw to the right depth, and then made several passes. I then used a hammer and chisel to remove the remaining wood. My chisel skills need some work, but I tested the pieces later and they fit properly. So unfortunately, this electrical outlet is right in the way of where the shelves are going to go. Just look at that ugly son of a bitch. So I decided that I would have to move the outlet. I thought about cutting a notch in the back of the shelving so that it would just fit over top the outlet, but having to reach through the shelf would just be a bit awkward. Plus, if I had anything stored on the shelf, it would just get in the way. So moving it was a better option. I unscrewed it from the wall and removed the copper wire from the sheathing. I then installed this metal junction box on a floor joist above the new location. I set the sheathing in place and drilled some new holes to mount it. This was also a good reminder that drilling through concrete block with a regular drill is such a pain in the... So with that done, I reconnected all the wires and put the cover back on. Up in the junction box, I used push to connect wire fittings to join all the wires together, and then putting the cover back on the box was a breeze. but I eventually got it, turned the power back on, and then tested it. Success. I used a bit of white trim paint to cover up where the box used to be. The paint didn't match the white that was already on the wall, but I figured it was good enough since the shelves would be sitting in front of it anyway. The last bit of prep to do before assembly was to add pocket hole screws onto the 2x4s. The pocket hole screws would be used to hold the structure together. I also put some pocket hole screws in the long ends of the 2x4s that would be used to hold the shelf surfaces down if needed. This Craig jig makes this process really easy. I think it's funny though that even with something as simple as this, I find myself getting better and better at it as I go. It seems like no matter how simple a project may be, I'm always learning something new or developing a skill, and I find that to be pretty satisfying. I set out all the pieces for the bottom row of shelves, and then noticed a problem. Each section of shelf is 4 feet long, and the middle rack is no exception. But if you look at the notches for the vertical supports on the outer rack, there's a cutout for 1 2x4 width and 1/2 2x4 width. On the inner rack, there are 2 half 2x4 widths. This means that the center supports were cut 1 3/4 inches too short. I cut some new supports that were the proper length this time, and then got started on assembly. And just like before, I got better and better as things progressed. Since the shelves were set 1.5 inches up off the floor, I could use the side of a 2x4 as a spacer. The center rack screwed me up again though. I forgot that I had to stand the 2x4 up as a spacer because the supports were set sideways. Here's where the pocket hole screws came in handy. This pocket hole clamp was also helpful for holding things in place while I put in the screws. Now for the first piece of plywood. This one fit pretty well, but as it turned out, I wouldn't have that luck with all of them. The next one overlapped the first one enough that even the rubber mallet wouldn't set it in. So I skipped ahead to the third shelf. It was a tight fit, but it did go in with a little persuasion. I took the middle piece out, trimmed the edge with a circular saw, and then set it into place. I used spacers again to start setting the supports for the next row of shelves. I then used the same spacers to start the center rack supports. Anyone seeing the problem here? Well, I didn't, and I went ahead and attached the support. But then I realized...
Son of a... That's not how you do it.
I made some new spacers that were 2 inches taller and then put the support in at the correct height. As I went on though, I kept having problems with the plywood not fitting. Each one had to be taken back out and trimmed down. And then refitted back in. I'm not going to show you every time this happened, but it was a huge pain. Because of how tight all the plywood was, the pocket hole screws were really only needed to hold down the top shelf and a couple other shelves. Since I've been climbing all over them, I know the shelves are stout enough to not have to worry about them overturning, but I can always secure them to the wall sometime down the line if I need to. Despite the extra effort that I had to put in, I'm still pretty happy with how everything turned out. So before I let you go, I just wanted you to get a chance to see what the shelves look like when they're full. And now the bedroom looks like this. But let's take a second to talk about the expense of building these shelves and how to make them even better. So my total expense was about $300, and that's probably about twice what you could do if you use different materials. Instead of buying 2x4s, you can buy 1x3s, and instead of buying plywood, you can buy something cheaper like OSB. I went for 3/4 inch plywood, and you could probably get away with 1/2 inch plywood. This would bring your cost down quite a bit. Now, one way to make this better. So right now, each of these shelves is held up just by the screws. So if you think about all 4 of the supports on each side of the shelf, the only thing stopping them from crashing down is the screws that go into these vertical supports. For what I'm going to use the shelves for, that's more than enough support to handle all the weight. But if you need the shelves to be a lot stronger, you could add supports to it like this. Sliding a 2x4 in here underneath would cause all the weight of the shelf to be on this 2x4, which is going to be a lot stronger than your screws. Now if you do this on every shelf, it'll transfer the weight from the top all the way to the floor through those 2x4s. Now as far as building the shelves so that these vertical supports are inset into the shelving and don't stick out, it's probably obvious from the video that it's not worth the extra effort. I'm not exactly unhappy that I built them that way because I'm happy with how they look, but it would have been a lot easier not to do that. I guess I would say that if I was going to build shelves again for another part of the basement or maybe my garage, I would probably just do it the easy way. So hopefully some of you guys found this video helpful. If you have any other ideas for building storage racks, leave a comment down below. See ya.